I'm Lauren Hudak, a student from Birmingham City Home High School. I'm a senior, and my big board presentation is called "The United States, or the Real Price of the United States Intervention in the Middle East." I'm going to start out with some facts on some numbers. Bear with me; they are important to our presentation. 655,000 Iraqis have lost their life as a result of the Iraq War. 21,000 civilians are estimated to have died as a result of the war in Afghanistan. 20,000 to 50,000 civilians have been slaughtered in Pakistan. In terms of U.S. casualties, over 6,000 American soldiers have lost their lives in the Middle East, and 1 million have been wounded, in addition to the 2,753 American civilians killed in the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. This isn't counting the multitude of American civilian casualties that have occurred as a result of Islamic terrorist attacks such as the U.S. Embassy bombings of 1993 and 1998, the Boston Marathon bombing of 2013, and the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. So these numbers may be hard to comprehend, and they may seem meaningless, but they are real people that died as a result of a real war. And they prove that the conflicts between the U.S. and the Middle East are taking a huge toll on both of our regions. And it's a war that we hear a lot about, and to me it's important to examine the root causes of the war in order to understand how we can prevent it. So the reason I became interested in this topic was just because in the past 15 years, of course, but especially in the past year, to me it's been more prevalent. We've been hearing more about it, and more has been happening between these two regions. And I also started to become more aware of this conflict as I recently committed to serving the U.S. Army. And I'll be attending West Point for my undergrad, and then I will be serving afterwards for 5 years or more in the U.S. Army. And so I started to realize that at one point I most likely will be stationed in the Middle East if the war keeps going the same way that it is now, or if the conflict continues. And so I decided that it would be to my advantage to become more familiar with the conflict and the root causes, and to kind of draw my own conclusions about them. So after examining the conflict between our two regions, I kind of concluded that, as with most armed conflicts, the war in the Middle East has perpetuated distrust between the citizens of America and the citizens of the Middle East. So the war has given rise to a whole host of ideological and social differences that we see every day, and they've been proven to be exceedingly detrimental to our social relationship. This is true of most wars, but the conflict between the U.S. and the Middle East is unique in that the social and ideological differences that have arisen as part of the war have actually impacted the political relationship between these two regions, not just the social relationship. So this helped me kind of draw my thesis, which is that the widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. So I'll do this by using quotes from historians. I read many articles, many political opinions, and I watched the news a lot, and I got a good feel for the conflict. And I definitely studied a lot of the history of the conflict. And that's where I'm going to start the body of my presentation. And I want to look first at the early history of U.S. intervention in the Middle East, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, just because I want to look at how the conflict has changed and transformed over time to prove my thesis. So U.S. intervention in the second half of the 20th century, that's when it's really, from looking at the major political events that have happened between us, that's when our relationship started to become more relevant in the scope of how the conflict began today. So, and really the first major incident that occurred between the U.S. and the Middle East is in 1947, when the UN officially officially recognized the state of Israel. And this I'll talk about more later in my presentation, but that kind of sets a tone for where the U.S. started in the Middle East, and it was as I'll talk about later, it was a negative start. It was not something that most countries in the Middle East were happy about. But the major U.S. intervention in the country began during President Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, and two incidents come to mind when you think about Eisenhower and the Middle East, and that's the Iranian coup d'etat of 1953 and the Suez Canal crisis of 1957 or 1956. And both of these are really important. The coup d'etat happened when America decided to intervene in the leadership of Iran, because the oil production of Iran was being controlled by a British company, and Iran was thinking about nationalizing the oil trade. And so the U.S. intervened with a coup, and we put our own leadership in charge. And we were asked to do it by Britain, but we had our own, or according to Eisenhower, we had own interests for doing that. Some include kind of trying to suppress the spread of communism, which we thought was rampant in those countries, and we thought nationalizing the oil production would contribute to that. Another reason includes encouraging further nationalization in the country, as well as being sympathetic to oil interests with the European trade. And the Suez Canal crisis was similar, where Egyptian President Nasser announced his plan to nationalize the Suez Canal Company, which was a very important economic and political advantage. At the time, it had been partly owned by Britain and France. And so Eisenhower announced what he called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And under this doctrine, the country could request American economic assistance and/or aid from U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. And so Eisenhower announced this doctrine and able to kind of police the situation that was happening, the conflict between Egypt and the British and French and Israel-owned Suez Canal. And America really did this because President Eisenhower did this because he didn't want Russia to have too much control, because they knew that Russia would step in and help Egypt, and he once again feared the spread of communism. So he introduced this doctrine, and this doctrine had a lot of political precedents, and it really set the tone for U.S. foreign policy, because it really proved that it was now officially America's job to police the Middle East, and it set a huge precedence for intervention in the Middle East. So these two events really kind of started U.S. intervention in the Middle East in the second half of the 20th century, and after this, things really picked up. There was a lot that went on in terms of putting dictators in power, and a lot of intervention that went on. So as I've illustrated with this political precedents began to take hold in the latter half of the 20th century, and the U.S.'s influence in the region only grew stronger. The Iranian coup, the Suez crisis, multiple peace agreements, allying with Israel through multiple wars with the Arab League, the Gulf War, overthrowing Saddam Hussein, all these instances were done out of political necessity or strategy. However, as you look at how the war has changed, or how the conflict has changed over the years, it is my opinion that this level of involvement that begins decades ago is bad for our relationship now, or is detrimental to our relationship now. So after this continued political intervention during the second half of the 20th century, certain extremist elements in the Arab world began to organize against American interests globally. And this can be seen in a visual that I'll have, which will probably take about 2 minutes to explain. But the visual proves that there's deep social distrust between Arabs today, or it's a pull from Arabs today towards U.S. citizens. And it shows favorability ratings by Arab country, or by some of the main players in the Arab League, such as Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they give the U.S. some of the lowest favorability ratings out of all the European countries. And it sets a precedent for them having social distrust, or the Arabs having social distrust for United States citizens. And so it's important to stress that there are many, many possible reasons for this distrust, and you can't ignore the social tensions and some of the more shallow surface tensions that can occur between two countries. And an explanation of these, a more detailed explanation, can be found in my paper, because there are many reasons that can occur. But after the polls, you can kind of deduce that the biggest reason for their mistrust is the war in Iraq, America's position in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and then also just a general sum up of the U.S. intervention in the Middle East, and how it has not, for many Arab citizens' views, it has not been proven to help their country. So this will also be in the slide, but I'm going to summarize it, but it will be a visual. So the majority of Iraqi respondents say that the impact of the war has been negative with respect to their personal safety and security, 72%, economic development and employment, 66%, administration of government services, 59%, relations with neighboring countries, 54%. One half feel there has been a negative impact on political freedom. One half of Iraqis feel the impact on education has been negative. So this kind of sums up how the Iraqi citizens feel about the Iraq War, and it's not favorably. So this kind of sets the tone for one of the more obvious grievances that many Arabs have against America. So thus, members of the Arab world have made it clear. Oh, also, it's important to talk about the Israeli-Palestine conflict when talking about grievances against America from Arab, because that's one of the number one on the list. And as most of you probably know, the Israeli-Palestine conflict is still going on and has been for at least the past 100 years. And many Arab countries refuse to recognize Israel as a state. They believe that they're illegally occupying the land, and so Palestine, which is a small faction of Israel, they're two separate countries, but Palestine has been at war with Israel together for the past 50 years, and they are actively warring with each other. And so the fact that the UN has officially recognized Israel as a state and also continues to provide aid to Israel through the war, the U.S. pretty much backs Israel's war against Palestine. So the Arab countries, most of them around it, they have a very, very obvious distrust for America because Palestine is mostly an Arab nation, whereas Israel is mostly made up of the Jewish. So the Arab League is very much against America supporting Israel, and members of the Arab world have made it clear that any country that publicly supports and funds Israel has declared itself anti-Islamic. And so this grievance is number one at the list when talking about Arabs' anti-American feelings. So these grievances kept coming, and as a result, in the late half of the 20th century, the Middle East saw a rise in terrorist groups that were bent on attacking American interests. So some of these terrorist incidents that occurred kind of near the end of the 20th century, and as a result of the U.S. intervention in the Middle East, was the April of 1983 with the bombing of a U.S. embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. This was one of the first really major bombings on the U.S. embassy, and it was credited to the Islamic Jihadist organization, which was a fundamentalist Shia group. Also second was the World Trade Center bombing of February 26, 1993. The Kenya and Nairobi dual simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings that occurred in 1997, and the 2000 attack on the USS Kola in Yemen. So when looking at the causes of these attacks, many Islamic fundamentalist groups are to blame because, of course, you can't just blame one person. Each attack, many people went into it, many different ideologies of people planned it. However, leading up to the turn of the century, many of the terrorist uprisings were able to be linked back to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group Al-Qaeda. So with each of these attacks, especially the last one, 2000 attack on the USS Cole, and the simultaneous U.S. embassy bombings. With each of these attacks, Al-Qaeda became more influential in the Middle East and was able to gather enough resources to commit what was inarguably the most heinous attack to ever occur on American soil, the bombing of September 11, 2001. So in many ways, 9/11 marked the turning point for U.S.-Middle East foreign relations. Before the 9/11, the U.S. intervention, it was mainly to settle political disputes. We saw this with Eisenhower Doctrine in the Middle East and the Suez Canal crisis. All of those were really to settle political disputes and to establish a political presence in the Middle East. However, after 9/11, we officially entered into the War on Terror, which can pretty much be summarized as an ideological war. In studying the relationships between these two countries, it is certainly relevant to examine how the average American citizen's perceptions of the Middle East and its inhabitants stood after 9/11. So I also have a visual for this. It'll take about 2 minutes to present, and it shows a poll done by Pew Research Group of the American opinion on the Middle East. And so the most obvious takeaway is that out of all the countries that America raided, Middle Eastern countries and the Arab or Islamic faith and Arab citizens, they're all three separate groups, received the lowest favorability ratings out of any country. So that was very important to know. It reflected the poll that was taken of Arab citizens' opinions of American citizens. However, one of the most important takeaways that I'll be showing from the visual is the bipartisan divide in opinion that you can see. And so it shows the difference between Romney Republican and Obama Democrat. So the people that voted Romney voted Republican consistently, the people that voted Obama and voted Democrats consistently. It showed how the difference in their voting for Arabs and Americans. And it was in almost every other country's voting, the two opinions, or the opinions between Romney and Republican voters and the opinions of Democrat Obama voters really reflected each other. In most of their votings on European countries, on Asian countries, on African countries, they reflected each other. However, when it comes to Arab countries, the two opinions were very much different. The Romney and Republican voters consistently gave them lower favorability ratings, while the Democrat Obama voters gave Arab nations higher favorability ratings. So this is a very, very important precedent because it just shows us the bipartisan divide in opinion, and it shows us that the average American's social views of the Arab countries is due to political opinion. And there's no other way to put that other than that Romney voters voted that they were very unfavorable of Arabs, and Obama voters voted that they were much more favorable. And so that shows that there is a political backing to the social tensions that exist between the two countries. So the results of this poll serve as probable evidence to support the claim that the 2001 terrorist attacks had a profound effect on Americans. So many believe that this shocked them into support when it came to Bush's retaliation efforts in the Middle East. So the years following September 11th, it showed a huge turning point in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So before where we had political necessity, now we have an ideological war. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both launched by Bush in response to the war on terror, turned out to be extremely long, costly, and bloody. The U.S. was now forced to defend itself in ways it never had before, and the relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East had reached a new low, as social distrust was at an all-time high. So kind of bringing it back to the central focus of my paper, I'm going to repeat my thesis, which was that the widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. So when you look at what we talked about in this presentation, we examined the beginning of the conflict, where it began in the the latter half of the 20th century, and we saw that most of the U.S. intervention in the Middle East was for political gain. It was strategic. It was not much different than the way that the U.S. dealt with other countries. And when you're looking at how the U.S. perceived the U.S. intervention after almost 50 years of hardcore intervention, it was obvious that many fundamentalist groups were not okay with the U.S. intervention, and that was a huge factor towards the rise of terrorism against the United States citizens. And so this once again fueled more distrust between Americans and Arabs. And so that led, in what many people believe, that led to 9/11, and it is now the reason for the social distrust between the two countries today. And so that's what is unique about this conflict, is that the social distrust has actually affected the political action that is taken against these countries today, and therefore, yes, okay. The conclusion is to repeat my thesis. The widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Big Word.